If the country wants to be safe and to make sure future generations are safe, given the climate that there is outside there, they'll have to be willing to pay more for it.
I'm Roland, and this is Battlelines. Lord Robertson of Port Ellen has been a Labour Defence Secretary, a Secretary General of NATO, and a family friend of the Telegraph's own late and much missed David Knowles. He is also one of 3 authors of Britain's new Strategic Defence Review, a document published this week and which purports to set the course for British defence in the next 10 years. It's an incredibly ambitious document. It talks about a major cultural overhaul in Britain, well beyond the armed forces, in preparation for peer adversary war. And I'm very glad to say that Lord Robertson is in the studio with me today. George, welcome to Battlelines. As you know, we've been chasing you for a very long time to get on here, but you've been in, I can't remember what the word is, but effectively kind of cloistered away while you were authoring the Strategic Defence Review, which came out this week. So it's three lead authors. It's you, a former Labour Defence Minister, a former Secretary General of NATO. You had a foreign policy expert, Dr. Fiona Hill, who, of course, in the world that I come from, which is kind of former Soviet affairs and so on, I mean, she's an absolute giant, and she, of course, advised Donald Trump in his first term on Russia, and a soldier, General Sir Richard Barrons. Why you 3, and what did each of you, the politician, the soldier, and the foreign policy expert, bring to the table?
Expertise. We brought knowledge, maybe perception, and a degree of independent thinking that John Healey admired and respected. And I think he wanted, to have a fresh view. I said at the very beginning, this is not business as usual. Our adversaries don't believe in business as usual, and therefore what we're doing can't be business as usual. So the 3 of us, I think, he believed, brought fresh insight. Richard Barrons is very, very bright, and known as that, overlooked for Chief of the Defence Staff, but that was David Cameron's judgment at the time, but very, very good and very well thought of. Fiona Hill, as you say, great expert on Vladimir Putin, on Russian affairs, but also having had the experience of working with Donald Trump. That gave her an edge in terms of what we were doing. And, I'd been in the ministry before, and I'd run NATO for 4 years. So I think he believed, and a lot of other people believed, that we brought a degree of insight, and we were able to be radical and bold in a way that an internal inquiry couldn't be. I know I saw a comment by a former Conservative Defence Secretary talking about bringing in the pensioners to do the advice, but we did it with the department, not to the department, but we had access to all the information, the most sensitive right up to the highly classified. We had access to all of that, as well as to the individuals in the department, and we listened to the outside world. We had 8,000 submissions sent to us, some brief, but some of them very, very long, in order to take account of. We listened to the industry, we went out, we talked to people. We spent 10 intensive months listening, consulting, researching, and then digesting it down to what we believed were the right recommendations. And some of them, will be quite uncomfortable for the government. Some of them will be difficult to deliver. But I hope when people read it, they'll notice one of the differences between this and other defence reviews. Most of the recommendations have got timelines, and these timelines have been accepted by the government. Some of them are quite tight. And they reflect the urgency of some of the recommendations, but also the importance of them for the future.
Thank you very much. As you say, you've been in this for a lifetime. Before we get into the meat of this, well, let me just read a bit through this elevator pitch that you've put in front of me, and I'll skim it if that's okay. But a truly transformational review designed to bolster deterrence, conventional and nuclear, by rebuilding warfighting readiness, a combination of homeland resilience, a new integrated force, and putting NATO first to make Britain safer and more influential, ruthlessly examining every aspect of defence, challenges business as usual in the more complex world, proposing a new partnership with industry, new national armament director, all of this, boosting reserves, invigorating training, confronting existing cultures and capturing innovations coming out of the experience of Ukraine. Before we get into the very, very meat, very, very quickly, you were last Defence Secretary, 97 to 99. You authored the 98 review. Obviously, the world has changed dramatically. So just give me a very quick sense of what you thought were how the world has changed, and when you three were looking at this question, this task put before you by the government. What is the landscape? Some of it might be quite obvious. We know about the war in Ukraine. The challenges that you think Britain needed to respond to.
Well, first of all, let me just take a picture of 1998. It's not all that long ago, especially for your listeners. We'd 10,000 troops committed to Northern Ireland in 1998, either in the province or ready to go there. NATO had just signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act with Boris Yeltsin, so we had good relationships established at that time. China was in the shadows, wasn't really a big player at all, and we thought globalization was a great idea. That world is gone. That was business as usual, and that world has changed dramatically. We now have great power competition, playing out in front of our eyes. The rise of China strategically and economically. We've got the rise of Iran and its malignant effect. We've got North Korea now part and parcel of the quartet that is cooperating in Ukraine. We've geostrategic shifts taking place all the time in terms of industry, commerce. The volatility of events in the world is unprecedented, probably in history. Combine that with the velocity of change, the very fact that we're doing this podcast and that anybody is listening to it, illustrates the way in which news has changed. So that you combine these two, the volatility and the velocity of change, and you get huge new vulnerabilities. What happens, if the lights go out in this studio, in this building here today, do we know how to get out of it? A few weeks ago, the whole of Spain and Portugal lost power. Two modern European countries lost power. Nobody seems to know why, but they lost power, and paralysis was the result. A transformer blows up at Heathrow Airport, and Heathrow Airport has to close down for 24 hours. We've got a situation where something like 90% of the data that we are using in this country and in Europe as a whole comes in undersea cables. I figure of 77% of UK's gas imports come from Norway in one pipeline. So the vulnerabilities from cyber and from the grey zone, disinformation, targeted assassinations, electoral interference, all of these things, that is part and parcel of today's world. So you've got on one hand, you've got the one side of the coin is the grey zone and the declaration of war by Putin on us at the moment, and you've got the future problems that come from this rising global competition between great powers, which will affect us in the future. So this report, our study, has not just been about what is needed at the present moment to deal with the problems we have at the moment. It's designed, to help my grandchildren and their children in the future and the problems that they are going to face.
Thank you. Let's get into the meat of it. So it's a very long report, 62 recommendations. I think around 45,000 words. Is that roughly where it comes out? I have not read it all in detail. I've skimmed it fairly thoroughly, but it's going to take a while for people to get through it. But I think it's fair to say
a good introduction and overview. So I recommend to people go on the web, read the introduction and the overview, and they'll get the picture. But I think that'll drag them into reading the whole report, which is very readable as well. He said modestly.
He says modestly. Who brought the flourish, the authorial flourish? Which one of you is a better writer?
Well, I'm not able to tell you who the writer was, the pen holder was, but she was brilliant, absolutely outstanding as well. So digested it all.
That makes things very clear. All right. Well, look. It's very ambitious. There's lots in it. There's talk about stopping the size of the army being reduced. There's talk about the nuclear deterrent. There's talk about NATO first. All of this is talk about industry. There's a cultural shift in there. It's very, very ambitious. The problem with all this, and I know this is not the first time this bowl has been balled at you, because you mentioned it on the way up, really, is about how much it's going to cost. I know you write in the report this was costed to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 3% when conditions allow in the next parliament. Those are the parameters you were given, if I'm correct. Yep. The problem is, and I know you are not in the government and you're not the Chancellor, is about whether or not that is enough money. And frankly, you'll have seen a lot of the commentary. A lot of people saying, "Look, Keir Starmer is still saying that's an ambition. It's not a fact that you're going to get to 3%." The question is this really properly costed? And the second question is that, okay, you've costed everything, but is that enough?
That's the benchmark that we were working to. We weren't sort of told, here's a blank sheet of paper. If you had an infinite amount of money, what would you do with it? That wasn't the task that we had. It might have been, you could have been, and then we'd have produced yet another think tank report that would have stayed on the shelf. So we were told basically what the parameters were, and the benchmark was 2.5% the year after next, and the 3%. So we've costed it. It's costed, ruthlessly been costed. I can tell you, meeting after meeting after meeting was all designed to do that. But in answer to the direct question about the government, just let me quote what the Defence Secretary said in the House of Commons on Monday. He was asked a question by Ian Duncan Smith. There's a good Daily Telegraph man, and John Healey said, "I say to the right honourable gentleman, do not take it from me at the dispatch box. Take it from the Prime Minister when he said, we will spend what is needed to deliver this review. He's made a commitment to the House. He's made that commitment today. The vision of this strategic defence review now becomes the mission of this government to deliver." So, that's the commitment, that's the promise. By the First Lord of the Treasury, by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So, we the three of us are going to be sitting there like crows on the branch of a tree, watching carefully as to how the recommendations are implemented and how and when they are. So, they've created a bit of a rod for their own back by having independent reviewers. But at the same time, it galvanizes, and I know that John Healey is absolutely determined to deliver what's in this report.
I mean, you don't think that he's asked for money and he's been defeated by the Chancellor, in a way?
No, he asked for money and he got the money. In fact, a lot of other departments in the lead up to the spending review are looking jealously. He got an extra £5 billion this year. He's got a commitment of the 2.5% of GNP the year after next, and the commitment to the 3%, which is necessary to deliver the review in the next Parliament.
They keep saying it's an ambition, not a commitment.
Well, but I've read to you what the Defence Secretary said to the House of Commons. These are the precise words that he said. He said another one here. We've committed the funds, we've built them into the terms of reference, and will allow this strategic defence review to be delivered over the next 10 years and beyond. So
There's just, I mean, there's just things when I'm reading it, and it makes me wonder whether you were sure the money's there or not. And I'll just give you an example and see your response. So, when we're talking about submarines, I think it's recommendation number 35. It doesn't tell us how many SSN submarines we need. It says the government must make clear how many they're going to build. So rather than offering a recommendation, it's telling us that the government has to make clear how many they're going to be, and that will provide the clarity for how much. And the government then this week talks about announces we're going to build up to 12 new attack submarines. Up to, I'm reliably informed by a man who has worked closely in government and used that word himself many times, generally can be translated as, we have no intention of building that number, but we would like you to think so. Why isn't there a firm number in there about how many we need?
Well, there is a defence investment plan that will come later in the year that will arise out of our recommendations. So you will notice that although there are some of these recommendations, you would talk about submarines and ships and the rest of it, that was not really part of our terms of reference. But, as I say, if you look at the guts of this report, there are a huge number of recommendations about the way in which we deliver defence. If you look at the delivery of submarines, for example, we're not terribly good at delivering them. We have in the past, but in the report there are recommendations about how we deal with our procurement issues in a really serious and different way in order to make sure that the ambition to get that number of submarines will actually be delivered as well. So that the reform of the system is as important as the output that is actually projected. But the defence investment plan that will come later, and it's not part of our job, that's for the government itself to do, is to decide how many planes, how many ships, how many submarines are actually going to be part of Britain. All we said was what was needed in order to be able to deal with the challenges of the future.
You don't say how many. I mean, that's not part of your job to say how many subs we need with the money we've got.
We talk about the principles that are involved in it. But I go back to what we were saying before the programme. We somehow have to get away. It was suggested at the beginning, the objective of our report should be to stop the Daily Telegraph judging Britain's defence by the number of people in the army. And I think we've done that. We've said that the army is going to increase in
Well, I wanted to ask you about that as well, actually, because the army is, I think, down to, it's meant to be at 73,000 at the moment, which I believe is the smallest it's been since the Napoleonic Wars. And I looked at what you said. You talk about, you say the total number of soldiers must grow to 100,000. We say it shouldn't. There can be no more cuts to the size. You say the total number of soldiers, and we're just talking about the land force here, the army, not the Air Force, Navy, should be 100,000, including reservists. And you talk about some point in the future when costs allow, increasing the size of the reserve by 20%, and maybe a very small increase in the number of regulars. And this bothers me, and the reason, okay, I work for the Daily Telegraph and I'm judging you on the size of the army, but the reason it bothers me is because I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. And one of the lessons of Ukraine, people talk a lot about drones and the evolution of technology and so on. The other lesson is that mass really matters, because when this kind of warfare starts, you will start taking casualties, and a lot of casualties. And I'll be frank with you, I don't really know how a British army that small would be able to regenerate after the first few weeks of combat in that kind of intense environment. So I'm really interested in whether that those numbers you came up with for the army, is that a reflection of just how expensive it is to get regular soldiers, to feed them, to clothe them, to maintain them, should it ideally be more?
Well, we make recommendations about the reserves because they're important, and they've been less important in the past. That's a fact of life. The professionals have never particularly liked or wanted the reserves. We've got to change that cultural opinion as well. So there's the strategic reserve. That is the people who've been in the armed forces and who are trained and who have a lasting commitment. And then a voluntary reserve beyond that as well, and that's got to be built up slowly, but it's expensive to do. But that's how you get the mass without necessarily increasing the number of full-time people. The army and the other services are finding it difficult to recruit, but we've actually got serious recommendations in the report about how that can be changed. With a whole variety of new means. The gap years, the limited services, the entry points. All of these things are here, laid out because we wanted to discover why people wouldn't join the armed forces. And how that could be changed, and I think we've been able to find
that's
a way
important.
Through that.
But are you really satisfied that 73,000 regulars is enough? If we are about to enter, as you've talked about, peer-on-peer intensive warfare.
Well, eventually, somebody will have to make a judgment about that as to whether you increase it. But how you increase it. At the moment, we've inherited. The government has inherited a situation where it's even less than the 73,000 there, and that's got to be resolved. And it's got to be changed, and we've got to reinvigorate the whole concept of the reserves and what they do and how they're trained and properly equipped in order to create that degree of mass. But we're in a different world now. The Ukrainians are now finding, what we've seen in the last 7 days from the Ukrainians, the blowing up the Kerch Bridge the other night. The weekend, the drone attack on the strategic bombers of the Russian Federation. It's ingenuity.
That's all
has a lot
true.
to do with it.
That's all true, and of course, Britain's rightfully, I think, not being an expert, but I think probably rightfully proud of our special forces, and probably our ability, I would think, to do things like that. But while all that's going on, there are about approaching 1 million Ukrainians in uniform, huge numbers of people holding the trenches up and down the line, taking a lot of casualties and having to be replaced. And that's why I'm asking about the size of the army.
Well, the army's lethality is what matters. It's the effectiveness of our forces that actually matter. At the end of the day, and Ukraine is not. It's an example, but it's not a template. The next war will be a very different war. In many ways, people say that generals and even strategists, are busy fighting the last war. And in some ways, the Ukraine is the last war. The next war is going to be a very, very different set of circumstances that we have to deal with, and therefore what we're proposing, in each of the chapters in here, are armed forces that will be relevant, to the future, which can be augmented, they can be accelerated, depending on circumstances and depending on how much the public is willing to spend on defence.
Let me ask you once more about money, and then we'll move on. I know, I know it's a. You want to talk about other things, but I think it's important. So this, we had the government's repetition of its 2.5% by 2027, 3% when conditions allow in the next parliament as an ambition. The Prime Minister made very clear it's an ambition. I'm not promising anything, he says, because I'm not going to get into fantasy politics. Nonetheless, a lot of criticism about that. And then we and not just us, by the way, this is in The Guardian as well. NATO sources briefing us, briefing our colleagues at The Guardian and other media, that actually UK is going to be pushed and required to spend 3.5% instead at the NATO summit later this month. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, says he wants 5%. And that's all part of his plan to basically keep Donald Trump and NATO on side. So I suppose that again, I come back to that question of, you're independent, you're not part of the government, you don't have to defend them. Is that current commitment enough, or should they raise it?
Well, I'm independent, but I'm not a government minister, so trade-offs have to take place. What we can say is what we think is necessary. We were given terms of reference, and these terms of reference are there. If the British people, as a whole, decide they want to spend more money on defence and less money on other things, then they will make that decision. At the moment, they don't. We had a general election campaign last year where defence wasn't really mentioned at all. We had a Conservative Party leadership campaign where defence wasn't mentioned or an issue. So people in the country have to examine the threats that exist at the moment and the threats that will be there in the future, and make a decision about what they have. So what we say in the report, and it's endorsed by the Prime Minister, is that we need to have a national conversation among the British people about defence and security. How safe do people want to be, and what are they willing to pay in order to be properly safe? Now, I characterise it as an insurance policy. The defence budget is the premium that we pay for the defence of the country as an insurance against things that would happen. Now, all of us have got household insurance. I've been married for 55 years, and I don't remember us making a single claim on the household insurance in all of that time. But yet it's absolutely essential, and we pay it an increasing amount every year for it, and that's what defence is about. So if the country wants to be safe and to make sure future generations are safe, given the climate that there is outside there, they'll have to be willing to pay more for it. I know that's a long-winded way.
No. It's a long-winded way of saying we've got to cut up the cake in a different way.
Or you increase the size of the cake.
Well, how? I know you're not in government now. Like when you last did a defence review in 1998, which, by the way, cut the size of the armed forces, I believe.
Well, we had 20,000 troops committed to Northern Ireland.
We'll get to that in a second, but how difficult is this really for the government? And I'm talking about dividing up that cake. When you were last in government, it was boom. It was cool Britannia. There was a lot more money around. Our adversaries were, I think our GDP was bigger than China and India combined. Something like that. We are now in a world post-financial crisis, post-COVID, post-war in Ukraine, where huge amounts have been borrowed to deal with each of those crises. The tax burden is already, I think, if it's not already, I believe that the language is on course to be the heaviest since the Second World War, and cuts have already been made to things like overseas aid to do so. I mean, I suppose the big question is just how constrained is the government in what it can do? I mean, I know you're not a minister now, but it doesn't look from the outside. It looks pretty difficult.
It is difficult, very, very difficult indeed. And all along, we've been faced with that prospect. There are things that you might want to do in defence, which are simply unaffordable. In 1998, when I did the review, we promised at the beginning it would be foreign policy led, and at the end of the process, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer said he was going to take a chunk of money out of our budget, and I have to say that I went with two of my junior ministers to see Tony Blair to say that if it happened, we would resign, that we'd given a pledge to the armed forces and to the country that it would be foreign policy led, and if arbitrary money was going to be taken out of it, we couldn't stay in the government. So the budget remained unaffected, the budget that we'd laid out there. But we don't live in a world where there is an infinite amount of money available. But it's a question of priorities by the people. And if in a national conversation, which the Prime Minister has promised he's going to do and he's going to lead, people come to the conclusion that they want to avoid the lights going out or the hospitals being shut or aircraft, the airports being shuttered and the data cables being broken, then the insurance premium has got to be afforded.
Is the blunt message, you talk about this big conversation that has to be had, is the blunt, unvarnished nature of that conversation, look, if you want to be safe, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. I mean, life is not going to be what you expected it to be, because we're going to have to make cuts elsewhere. Is that basically what you think the British public have to accept now?
We're promoting growth in this, and defence expenditure is a way of gaining growth. Then that makes the pie bigger, and the choice is less difficult to make.
But that's not where we are now. So you're basically saying the British public is going to have to accept that the cuts are going to have to come. Things are either you're going to be paying more tax, or other services are going to have to be reduced in some way in order to pay for our defence in this new world.
The German government managed to overcome a constitutional block on borrowing, a constitutional block which the Allies left them with after the war, in order to borrow specifically for defence. The European Union now has got a defence budget and it's got a commissioner for defence. The new world requires new thinking. Business as usual doesn't apply to the people who are attacking us, and it can't apply in normal budgetary terms as well.
I wanted to get into this question of culture. This is from Dom Nichols, our defence roving chief Ukraine man. So he's in Ukraine, and he was asking, look, he said, you said this review would be genuinely transformative. And he said that worried him partly because he's reminded of the old maxim of culture eats strategy for breakfast. So the review calls for greater resilience in society and industry. You say the government should mount a campaign to explain the threats Britain faces to the public, and a defence readiness bill that would allow the government to mobilise reserves and industry in times of crisis. And do you really believe that this or subsequent governments would put real and sustained effort into explaining adequately the threats we face and the eye-watering costs of dealing with them, given the parlous state of our defences today, plus the changes that would be demanded from society? Because we are talking about big changes to society.
We are, and they're not as big as the changes that will be affected if the lights go out and the data centres go down, and we're confronted with this sort of calamity that we saw in Spain and Portugal just a few weeks ago. So these are the costs that we have. The Prime Minister made it clear on Monday that we're paying the price in household items today for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, driving up the cost of living. The cost of a war is infinitely greater than that. We stopped paying for the Second World War in the 1980s. That was the sacrifice that was made at the time when we were paying off the national debt right up until then. So, you have to put on one side the cost of not doing things along with the cost of doing things as well, and therefore I think politicians have got to make the case, and that's part of the reason why I'm doing the Daily Telegraph podcast. It's just we're trying to get over the message, and we will. The reviewers and others will be going out to various parts of the country to make that argument about what the risks are, what the problems are, and what is going to necessarily need to be done in order to mitigate them.
I'm really interested if we could get a bit more specific about that. Because I think the impression I'm getting is that sacrifices are going to have to be made, and someone's going to have to level with the British people and say, look, whether it's more taxes, whether it's something else. And I was wondering if we get more specific. So let me give you an example. And I know we are not Russia, and when I put this to people, they say, you shouldn't compare Britain to Russia, you should compare Russia to NATO. But nonetheless, Russia is thought that this month Russia is going to suffer its millionth casualty, that's killed, wounded, and so on, not just killed, in the war in Ukraine sometime this month, which is, and I'm not suggesting that the British Army would ever fight in the same way as the Russian Army, but nonetheless, that is absolutely an extraordinary level of attrition for any war fought by any major power since 1945. On the other hand, up to 1945, it's fairly reasonable in the context of the number of casualties we got. Do you think this country needs to get used to the idea that it is going to take casualties and people are going to die? And I know it's a pretty blunt and unpleasant question, but I'm asking it because I spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I just saw a lot of people die, and you know, the prospect is, if the war that you're talking about ends up happening, this peer-on-peer conflict, you know, how would the British public respond if, you know, hypersonic missiles, cruiser missiles, I don't know, slam into Catterick or another barracks, hundreds of people are dead in one night, and things like that. Are these the kinds of things that this country should be talking about?
Yeah, we would, but we, in the review, are talking about how to avoid it. Deterrence is the question. You know, we all go to our beds at night safe because of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. That if anybody attacks a NATO country, the 32 countries in NATO, they know that it will be seen as an attack on all of the countries. So almost 1 billion people are covered by that particular guarantee. That's what deterrence is about. So what we're recommending here are a whole series of things that need to be done in order to build up our war readiness, in order to avoid having the conflict in the first place. You know, there are people who will still argue that if Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons in 1994 in return for the paper assurances of the Budapest Memorandum, that Russia would never have dared to have crossed the border. I don't. You can't prove that or disprove that. All I know is that NATO and the Article 5 guarantee is a deterrent to any aggressor who thinks that they can take on these 32 countries. So all of the missiles, all of the submarines, all of the planes that we are proposing and that are part of the build-up to war readiness are designed not to be used. They are designed to make sure that nobody fires the cruise missiles.
But you need but the only way that's going to work is if people think you're credible and you're prepared to use them.
Absolutely, you know, and we have to be. You know, I was Defence Secretary, and therefore I had a role in the key chain with the nuclear deterrent. And although I started my political career at the age of 15, demonstrating against the arrival of American nuclear submarines, you know, I had absolutely no doubt in my mind that if it came to the bit, I knew what needed to
be done because you were a Secretary General or a Defence Secretary. What about the rest of the British public?
Well,
is that what I'm getting at? Is, do you think we are really a society that could handle this crisis if it comes?
Well, we'll need to make sure that is the case and remind people about what it is. And I think that's the job of the media. It's the job of politicians, and we need to raise awareness of the issue. And that's why we say there needs to be this national conversation. What is it you want? What is the insurance premium that will keep you and your family safe in the future?
Can I ask you quickly about NATO? Because you talked about that, and the report is very much about NATO first, and Britain's got to make itself, you know, NATO first. It's believed. I mean, I'm pretty sure. This review was meant to come out in February, I believe. Then Donald Trump arrived, and the Americans were saying all kinds of things about, you know, commitments to European security and how Ukraine is a European problem and how and all of this, and it had to be delayed. I believe you had to rewrite things or insert things in response to that. Can I ask you how did the review change in response to Donald Trump's arrival in the White House? And it's not just the fact that Donald Trump's there; it's the rhetoric and the clear policy positions and preferences of his government.
The report didn't have to change a lot because we're still very close to the Americans, and we have an intimate relationship with them, especially in defence and security terms, and that hasn't changed since the president came. In relation to NATO, there's an element of rhetoric about what is being said at the present moment, which is contradicted by the people who articulate on behalf of the Trump administration. You know, they say that they simply want the imbalance that exists in NATO at the moment between the non-US countries, Canada and the Europeans and the United States of America, and that something has to be done about that. And a combination of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and the closeness of the threat has driven up European defence budgets quite dramatically over the period of time. But the structure that we have created here and the reforms within the system as it stands at the moment, are not affected by the vagaries of American politics.
What you said about NATO first and so on, that's not partly a response to, American disengagement from NATO and therefore the need to strengthen that alliance.
No, NATO first was in the manifesto of the Labour Party when it came to power, but it wasn't It's NATO first, but not NATO alone, because we've got wider responsibilities. But in terms of NATO first, it actually makes trying to build in our military into NATO in a much more intimate way than it was before. A lot of it was kidology. A lot of it was to do with just sort of pretending that you were compatible with it. But it's got to do now with making sure that we are actually NATO compatible, and that we are capable of leading in NATO.
I'm sorry to come back to this, but can we be capable of leading in NATO if the Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Finns, and so on are already heading towards 5% of GDP on defence, and we won't even commit to the 3.5?
What we need to focus on is what the money is spent on. When I was in the MOD and when I was in NATO, I was always making the point. I remember going to NATO headquarters on my first day in October 1999, saying I have three priorities. Priority 1 is capabilities, priority 2 is capabilities, priority 3 is capabilities. NATO is as strong as the capabilities that it actually has to its hand. And it's what you do with the money that you're spending. And Britain has the position of deputy SACEUR at the moment because we have got a record of achievement, a record of doing things that clearly gives us leadership within the alliance as a whole.
You said earlier, and I've heard this before actually from your co-author Richard Barron's made this point in a briefing earlier this week, that Ukraine it's a template, but it's not the template. You can't simply take it. I'm quite interested in how much you looked at the experience of the Ukraine war when drafting this review, how it influenced you, in what ways it does inform us, but perhaps also in what ways is it inappropriate as a template for us to study?
Well, we have gone out of our way to capture the lessons of Ukraine, the agility of the Ukrainians, the use of technology that is going to have to be built into whatever we do in the future. But air power has not been part and parcel of the Ukraine war or the defense of Ukraine, that it would be in any wider conflict. And therefore, you've got to distinguish between what we learn that they're doing and learn from the things that they're not doing. Learn from that the Russians started off with, the kidology of intelligence that they had, their belief in the invincibility of their armed forces with the top-down organisation, which crumbled within days of the invasion. Learning all of these lessons, but also moving forward, looking to 2035 and the kind of challenges that we're going to face at that time, and how we build war readiness in this country in order that we build sufficient deterrence that an adversary is simply not going to do to us what the Russians have done to Ukraine.
When you're doing this, when you're sitting there going, 2035, whatever, okay, I really want to know what is the what are the horizons we're working on, specifically in terms of Russian reconstitution, because we've had a lot of stuff out there. We had the head of the German army, I think, saying, we've got to be ready in 2 or 3 years for a war between Russia and NATO. Other people have said, oh no, it will take a decade and so on. What was the window that you were working on in terms of, the window in which we think that Russian threat, that reconstituted Russian threat, is likely to appear?
The decade is what we were working to. That was our view about what we needed to do. But that can be accelerated. It
So
can
be ready for an all NATO war in 10 years.
For a peer adversary attacking the United Kingdom, we're talking about that it would probably require the existing potential adversaries to reconstitute by that time. But it can be earlier. And therefore, the model that we've created, the model that we're promoting at the moment, can be accelerated, depending on circumstances.